What is up, guys, and today I'm going to be showing you how to install a double DIN touchscreen in a Pathfinder, Frontier, or Xterra equipped with the Bose or Rockford Fosgate system. So this is my original head unit. It's the Bose, and it's got the 4 connectors in the back plus this extra one, which isn't used by my car. Also, mine has steering wheel controls from factory, so I'll also be showing you how to hook up a steering wheel controller. Specifically, we have the Access ASWC1 controller, and since I have the factory amp that would come with your Bose or your Rockford Fosgate, you have to get this thing. It's called the PAC ROEM NIS2, NIS2, and this plugs directly into your factory harness right there. The wiring for this is pretty straightforward. Basically, it's as if you just had a normal adapter kit for any normal radio. The only difference is that there's this module right here, and the wires you're connecting are on this piece right here. So here is the connector that came with my radio, and it's got all the wires. The only difference using this thing and the steering wheel controller is that there's a few extra grounds and a few extra power wires that you have to put in to this harness that plugs into the radio. So I'll show you those. So for the power wires, this is just the switched 12 volt for the radio. And so what I've done is I took the remote turn on wire, which is this blue and white wire coming off the system interface, and connected it with the red wire coming off the interface. And then I took the power wire out of the steering wheel controller and also wired that into this. And then all 3 of those wires go into this one power wire to the radio. As far as grounds on this thing, what I've done is I have this, which this is just a, if I can get it to focus, it's just a blade connector that I'm going to be using a T-tap in the actual factory wiring in the car to ground the steering wheel control ground. And then what I've done is I've taken the ground off of the radio harness and the ground off of the steering wheel controller, as well as this extra wire, which is going to be a chassis ground, and I put those all into this one connector. And then on the other end, I put a little tiny length of wire in this tape, and then connected it to a blade connector, which then that's going to ground out the factory harness, and this is just going to go to a piece of metal behind the dashboard. For my head unit, since I'm using a Kenwood, I believe this also applies to JVC, but since I'm using a Kenwood, it has this wire, which is the steering wheel control wire. And so what I've done is I had this thing that came with the steering wheel controller, and it had 2 wires. It had a brown wire and a brown and white wire. And so the brown and white wire, what I've done is I just put I cut it off, and then I put a heat shrink over it to protect it. And then I just connected the solid brown wire to the actual steering wheel control wire on the radio harness. On the steering wheel controller, the only 2 wires besides ground and power, the red and the black right there, as well as the 3.5 jack, the only wires you're going to use other than those 3 are going to be these 2 wires, which these are the 2 signal wires. And so where there was extra wires, I just cut them off and then put a heat shrink over it. As far as wires you're not using on this interface right here, anything with a red line in it, these are the low outputs for the speakers, which you don't use if you're using a factory sound system. So I've just cut them off and also heat shrink them. Also, in my research when preparing for this, I learned that this ground is not reliable, so I'm just not gonna use it. I may cut it off or tape it or just like put it aside somewhere. But what I did instead of grounding this out is I ground out the radio harness, which is what I just showed with this blade connector. The only real thing you have to do inside the car is with this. So this doesn't apply to the Frontier. I'm not sure about the Xterra. I think the Xterra might have it, but I know the Frontier doesn't. Is this antenna. It has 2 ports in it because it's a diversity antenna. So my car has 2 antennas, and it just chooses which one has the best signal and uses that one. But since I'm using an aftermarket head unit, it only plugs into one of these plugs. And so this is the plug that plugs into the back of that. But this had 2 prongs, and so you have to get this adapter. But if you don't do what I did, you don't get to use both of your antennas. So what you have to do is, before you plug this in, you have to get a tiny little piece of copper wire and stick it down into the 2 prongs of the inside of the adapter. And then you plug this, the factory antenna plug, back into the adapter. And so that bridges the gap between this wire and this wire. So both antennas are actually being used into this one connector. This is where things got tricky when I was trying to figure out how to wire the steering wheel controller. So this right here is my steering wheel harness, and it only has 3 wires. But everyone else that I saw had the 16 pin, which has a lot more wires in here. So I couldn't really find a ton of good information about how this is wired, but I think I figured it out. So I'm gonna wire this up real quick and I'll show you if it does work. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm just stripping back this protective plastic, and I T-tapped these 3 wires. And so what I'm gonna do is, on the steering wheel controller, I'm gonna put the spade connectors like I put on the ground, and so that's gonna allow me to just plug them into these T-taps. So what I did on the steering wheel controller is I took the 2 signal wires and put a spade connector, which these spade connectors will connect to those T-taps. Okay guys, so after a bit of troubleshooting, I figured out that my T-tap connectors actually didn't go through the insulation on these wires. They're too small. So what I had to do is cut off this connector here. But I did get the wiring right. I'll throw up a diagram that I made of how to do the wiring for this specific harness, but I don't know if I can get it with filming with one hand, but it is working. Once I get everything tidied up, I'll go ahead and show you it working. So I'll throw up a diagram and then I'll show you it working. So getting the steering wheel controller hooked up was actually pretty easy once I figured out that those wires were not tapped correctly. All I had to do was put the key in the ignition and turn it to on. I didn't even have to start the car, just turn it to the on position. And you'll see the light on here start blinking really fast, red and green. And then you hold your volume up for 7 seconds, I think it said, or until it stops blinking. And then you let go of it, and it'll blink green 7 times, which means it registered that you held the button up. And then it will blink up to 18 times depending on your radio. I have a Kenwood, so it only blinked twice. And then what you should see after the red lights indicating your radio, what you should see after that is a solid red light. If you don't see a solid red light, you'll see red and green flashing slowly. That means it wasn't able to connect to the vehicle. But if you see the solid red, that means it connected successfully. Alright guys, so after getting everything hooked up, I'm just going to show you how it works on the radio. So you have your tuner right here. So when I press that, it changes the channel, as it should. And then you have your volume. So that works with the module. And the power button, the factory head unit power button doesn't do anything because this has its own dedicated power button on it. And then the mode button changes from radio to disc to whatever other music apps you have on here. So like if I press it, I'm not sure where it'll go, but I think it'll go. Yeah, so it just scrolls through all the different things you have to play music through. So I hope this video helped out a lot. Comment if it did, and see you guys later.